Hey everyone, about a month ago I did a little presentation for the American Geophysical Union on geology and Game of Thrones. And so here is that presentation. Also, by the way, this was the second of two presentations that AGU had. If you'd like to watch the first one, which is by Miles Trayer of Stanford University, I've left the link below. And so here we are, geology and Game of Thrones.
Okay, hello and welcome to the special AGU webinar titled Geology and Game of Thrones Part 2, featuring our guest speaker, Preston Jacobs. I'm Eric Hankin, the Student and Career Programs Manager at AGU, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. You do not need to have seen Part 1 of this mini-series in order to understand today's presentation, but you can access that recording by going to the AGU Webinars website, webinars.agu.org. Presenting today is Preston Jacobs. Preston is an analyst and performance auditor for the United States Department of State and resides in Germany. In his spare time, you can catch Preston's thoughts on Game of Thrones episodes and the Song of Ice and Fire books, where he'll discuss different theories about the books and what's happening in the show on his very popular YouTube channel, Rereading Ice, Rethinking Fire. Today, he'll share his thoughts on how geology has impacted the Song of Ice and Fire storylines and some geologic questions to ponder as both the TV and book plots continue to develop. And with that, I'll pass the mic over to Preston. Preston, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm Preston Jacobs, and I'll be your speaker today. And we'll be talking about geology and Game of Thrones. Now, many of you may be wondering, if geology is really part of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. After all, this is a story about zombies and dragons that appears magical. But I would argue that, in fact, George R.R. Martin did think about geology, at least somewhat, when inventing this universe, at least as a layman. And so that's what we'll be discussing today. And so before we start out, I'd like to have a little poll just to get sort of where everybody feels about, how much science is in the story. So, Eric, maybe you can...
Yeah, so here's the poll question. First one right off the bat. In which genre would you categorize Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire? Do you consider it to be a fantasy story? Oh. Okay, we have a misprint in the poll, and that's my fault. It says fantasy story twice. If you think it's a science fiction story, choose option B. If you think it's a fantasy story, choose the first option. If you think there's no difference between fantasy and science fiction, choose number 3. And if you're not sure, choose number 4. Starting off strong. And we'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Closing the poll. Okay, 46% consider it to be option A, a fantasy story. Next highest is there's no difference between fantasy and science fiction. And 16% think it's a science fiction story.
All right. Now, there's a reason why I asked that question, and a lot of it has to do with the background of George R.R. Martin. He has a background in writing and journalism and chess and teaching, but his career is mostly about writing science fiction stories, and this is kind of important because George R.R. Martin, he's no scientist and he's no expert, but he still appreciates science, and he still appreciates making things scientifically accurate. And if you were to actually ask him if there's a difference between fantasy and science fiction, he would say no. But I'd like to show you a couple pictures here. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, we have a George R.R. Martin dragon. And in the lower right, we have a traditional dragon that you might see in popular culture. This is the cover of Dungeons and Dragons, the old role-playing game. And if you notice, there is a big difference between them, and that is the George R.R. Martin dragon has no arms. He just has wings, while the traditional dragon has arms and wings. And this is biology, but it shows that George R.R. Martin is paying attention to science. In the real world and all of history, there's been no creature that's had 4 limbs and wings. Birds, pterodactyls, bats, they all have 2 legs and wings, no arms. And so our author wanted to be scientifically accurate when portraying fantastical dragons. And so, this kind of shows that our author, he's a layman, but he has an appreciation for science because he has a science fiction background. And so that's kind of where we're heading with the story. And so I'd first like to ask a kind of basic question. how old is Planetos, and how did this come about? And this may seem really basic and unimportant, but our plot, our plot seems to involve, a fight over monarchy and the invasion of White Walkers. But really, when you ask this question, it cuts to the heart of everything. Much in the way, if you ask this question about our Earth, it cuts to the heart of everything. And when I say that, I mean it reveals how we approach and examine the world. We have a historical and legendary way to look at our Earth, and we have a geological and scientific way to look at our Earth. And keep in mind that on our Earth, these are very different stories. Our Earth, legend and history says that the Earth is thousands of years old and was created by a god in 6 days via divine magic, while geologists find that the Earth is billions of years old and came about through natural scientific law. So here on Earth, there's a significant disparity between legend and history and geologic truth. And so I should mention that other fantasy stories like Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings, if you were to ask this similar question, how old is Middle-earth, there's no disparity. The legend is the literal truth. A god called Yuvatar, using divine magic, created Middle-earth thousands of years ago before Frodo came along. He moved the continents, he created the sun and moon, he created life. It's a creationist tale, and that's all there is to it. And we're not supposed to question these facts. There's no hidden secrets. And looking at science, it may be fun, but it doesn't reveal anything about Frodo, his friends, or the story at all, because the author, J.R.R. Tolkien, wasn't considering geology or science to any great extent when he created the story. And so, we have to ask ourselves: is Planetos, is it like Earth, where geologic truth is the real truth? Or is it like Middle-earth, where histories and legends are the real truth? And so I'd like to jump and talk about a major historical event that you guys may know, and that is the coming of the first men to Westeros and their war with the Children of the Forest. And so for those who aren't familiar, the continent of Westeros was once ruled and inhabited by the Children of the Forest, and the first men invaded 12,000 years ago, and they warred with the Children. And according to Maester Luwin, the Green Seers used dark magic to make the sea rise and swept the land away, shattering the arm of Dorne here. And so, we have humanity crossing over a land bridge, sea levels rising, breaking this land bridge 12,000 years ago. Now, if this seems a little familiar, there's a reason for that, because, we have our own Earth, and we know that there was a land bridge in between Asia and the Americas, and people figure that around 12,000 years ago, humanity passed over this land bridge in a window in between when the glacier was there and it receding, and when the sea levels rose in order to make the trip impossible. And so we have this direct parallel that our author is making with time and how things function. And so yes, like, our author is a layman, and but we can see this parallel. Now, a geologist may say, okay, it wasn't actually 12,000 years ago, but you have to remember that our author wrote this in the 1990s, and he's not going to get everything exact. Some geologists think that this crossing happened, at 11,000 years ago or 13,000. There's a lot of arguments over this, but our author's a layman, so he says 12,000 years ago this happened. And so, this is the larger point. There's a parallel between Planetos and Earth. We have a migration and inundation. The time periods line up, and so, even though there's this magical explanation, on Earth we have a geological, scientific explanation for the same thing. So we don't necessarily need a magical explanation on Planetos when the scientific one works. And so, we have to ask ourselves, did the Children of the Forest really use dark magic to make sea levels rise, or did they break the Arm of Dorne, or is the Arm of Dorne simply inundated due to rising sea levels accompanying the end of an ice age?
So, Preston, I think this is time for another poll question, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's bring that up. So, how do you think the Arm of Dorne broke? the natural end of an ice age, the children of the forest magic, climate change, either caused by the children of the forest or caused by humans, or you're not sure. Love to hear from y'all. Please select your choice, and we'll close the polls in 3, 2, 1. Closing the polls. All right, and it looks like the overwhelming answer, Preston, with almost 60%, is the natural end of an ice age.
All right. So maybe I'm being persuasive. Now, we may never know the real answer to this. Our author may never reveal it, but I think our author is trying to at least make the parallel and make us question things. And he does this a lot, actually. And these aren't geology related, but in our story, we have things like in A Feast for Crows begins with people getting magically resurrected on a beach. But if you pay attention, it might actually be mouth-to-mouth resuscitation awakening these people on a beach. Or, for instance, the character of Qyburn is kicked out of the Citadel for necromancy, opening bodies of the living. But is that just surgery? We have that in our world. And you know, Daenerys, when she goes into the House of the House of the Undying, and she has visions, she also drank Shade of the Evening before that. Are these really magical visions, or are these psychotropic drugs? And we don't have the answers, but I think our author wants us to question it. He wants us to be critical. And so I'm going to bring up another parallel to our world, and that is the Fall of Ghis. And for those who don't know, Ghis is the empire that eventually becomes Slaver's Bay. It's where Dany comes in and conquers on season 3 and lives there all the way through season 6. It's the home of the cities of Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor. And Slaver's Bay is a kind of has-been society. It was once great. It was once the dominant civilization on Earth. It was called Ghis. And then there's the question of, why did Ghis decline? And Dany claims that it happened 5,000 years ago, that Valyrian armies sacked the cities and their dragons burned everything, and their fields were sown with salt and sulfur. And that's a colorful story, but it doesn't really make any sense when explaining the decline of a civilization. Ghis didn't collapse all at once. It occurred over hundreds of years with multiple wars. The cities have clearly been rebuilt. Not to mention, there's the question of salting fields and sulfuring fields. We hear about this with Rome salting Carthage's fields after the Third Punic War, but we actually don't have any evidence that salt makes tracts of land unusable in the long term. In fact, Carthage was pretty prosperous after the Third Punic War, and salting wouldn't poison land for thousands of years. I mean, there's this thing called rain, and salt is pretty easily soluble, and it would wash away. And as for sulfur, sulfur is actually good for crops. And so, you know, even if we set aside the ridiculousness of the story, if the Valyrians and their dragons were supposed to be the problem for Ghis, then why didn't Ghis rebound after the Valyrians all died, which happened 400 years before Dany arrives? And so history and legends fails to really explain why Ghis declined and stayed that way. But it turns out there is a good geological answer for this. And that is, it has to do with bronze. Now, in our story, Ghis, and actually this big harpy of Ghis, is made of bronze. And that's actually, you know, a literary reference that Ghis was an empire of the Bronze Age. It had pyramids. It's a stand-in for a Bronze Age society. And we know that bronze is made of both copper and tin. And as we see in the periodic table, tin is actually a pretty heavy metal. It's relatively rare on Earth. The heavier a metal generally, the rarer on Earth. It's certainly heavier than copper. And this is kind of a big deal, as bronze has a 7-to-1 ratio of copper to tin, but on Earth we only have a 25-to-1 ratio of copper to tin. And so, and actually Daenerys specifically tells us that Slaver's Bay is rich in copper, and we learn from Tyrion that they actually import tin. So tin is rare in this world. It's getting imported. They don't have it in Slaver's Bay. And so from all of this, we can actually kind of deduce how Old Ghis society functioned. They had the copper. They were a bronze-oriented society. they would rapidly consume their own tin, and so they would need more tin, and they'd need to import it from the outside. And so if we actually look at the map, this is where we actually hear about, in the yellow, this is where we actually hear about tin existing in the world. Slaver's Bay is here at the green. And so there would actually be a tin trade. It would either go around Essos or down the mighty Rhine River. And the big thing is it all goes past Valyria. And so Valyria could actually disrupt this tin trade, and that would be a major problem for Ghis. And if this all seems familiar, that's because it did happen in the real world. Our Bronze Age collapse, which happens in 1200 BC, occurred largely because of the scarcity of tin. The Middle East, the Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians, they needed more and more tin for their bronze, and so they established trading routes to Western Europe. And then the Sea Peoples disrupted this trade route, leading to the Greek Dark Ages and the collapse of the Hittite Empire and the receding of the Egyptian Empire. And so after this Bronze Age collapse, people looked more and more to iron, which is something that's much lighter than even copper, and it's 800 times more common, in fact, than copper. And thus we saw the birth of the Iron Age. And so with this, 5,000 years ago, the collapse of the Bronze Age in Essos, we also have another kind of parallel, because this is when the Andals invade Westeros, and the Andals famously have iron. And they famously fought the first men who had bronze weapons with their iron weapons. And so we have this again, a parallel to our world, where the Bronze Age begins at 1200 BC, the Bronze Age collapses at 1200 BC. In Westeros, it happens 5,000 years ago, but we have a similar situation where our author is connecting geology and history. And so I'd like to check again if I'm being very convincing. So it's time for another poll. So I'll hand that over to Eric.
Yeah, let's queue up the next poll. So why do you think Old Ghis collapsed? The disruption of the tin trade, the wrath of the Dragon Lords, the rise of the Iron Age, or are you really not sure? We'd love to hear from you, and we'll close the polls in 3, 2, 1, closing the polls. Okay, Preston, it looks like 40% think it was the disruption of the tin trade, 31% think it was the rise of the Iron Age, and only 9% think that Dragon Lords played a major role in all of this.
So I'm being a little more convincing. I'd like to return to the question of whether the world is operating via magic or science. Is this like Middle Earth or regular Earth? Because so far, I've showed some examples where geology can sufficiently explain major events, such as the coming of the first men and the fall of Ghis, just like geology explains the first Americans and the Bronze Age collapse. And so I would argue that Planetos seems to be operating like Earth, at least geologically. And so I'd like to talk about as well, because the option is, are we looking at geology, or are we looking at history and legends? Can we really trust history? Because generally in our world, the further back you go, the less certain we are of events. And there is actually a scene in the book that happens twice. This is at the end of the fourth book and the beginning of the fifth, or beginning of the fourth and beginning of the fifth book, both told from different perspectives, Sam and John's. And Sam tells us that the oldest histories were written down well after the Andals came to Westeros. The first men didn't write down anything except for runes on rocks. And so everything that we know about the Age of Heroes, the Dawn Age, all of these things that happened thousands and thousands of years ago were written thousands of years later by septons. And there are archmaesters of the Citadel that question it all. And so right now, even the characters in our story are questioning history and the veracity of it. And so still, let's look at some other questions of how old is Planetos. Let's get back to this question. And so if we ask the maesters, they actually themselves have varying opinions. So an acolyte named Lazy Leo tells us that an archmaester named Periston thinks that the world is 40,000 years old, and another Archmaester named Malos says it's 500,000 years old. Periston, we know, is a historian, so at least histories he thinks go back about 40,000 years. Malos, I don't know, but I'm guessing he might be an archaeologist for that kind of number. We do have another testimony on how old the world might be, and that is from the Children of the Forest. And they claim they've been in their cave for 1,000,000 years. So maybe the world is 1,000,000 years old, or a few million. But if we're actually going to geology, and again, this world does seem to function somewhat like geologically, like our Earth does. If we go to geology, the Planetos is at least hundreds of millions of years, if not billions of years old. And the largest evidence of that is the presence of caves everywhere. The caves are pretty ubiquitous in our story, perhaps the most famous being the cave that Jon and Ygritte have sex in, and the cave of the three-eyed crow or three-eyed raven in the show. And these caves are formed from the dissolution of limestone over the course of millions and millions of years, and limestone itself is formed from the buildup of dead marine organisms like coral and mollusks over the course of millions and millions of years, usually in tropical reefs. And so if we look at our map, this is the location of known limestone deposits in our story. And you can see that there's quite a bit of limestone around Cracklaw Point. This is Brienne's story where she goes up and down into the riverlands. And then Jon, north of the wall, comes across quite a few caves up there. There's some caves around Winterfell and in the north. And then Arianne Martell runs into some caves down in the Stormlands. But if you notice, these locations, especially the ones north of the wall, are nowhere near reefs, tropical reefs. And so in order for a limestone to get up north, you'd have to have millions and millions of years of limestone formation in a tropical reef, and then millions and millions of years of tectonic movement to get it up north, and then millions and millions of years of dissolution to get that cave formed. And so the big question is, who cares? Okay, there's caves. Well, the point I'm making is that Planetos is a very, very old planet. It's like our Earth, and unlike Middle-earth. And the history we've been given can't really be trusted. And so for the most part, considering that the Planetos is at least hundreds of millions of years old, we know it has a mostly unknown past. Even the Children of the Forest claiming 1,000,000 years old is just this tiny sliver of time. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what was going on in Planetos in this entire unknown past period? I mean, did they have dinosaurs, trilobites, things like that? And we don't know, but we do have some very, very weird things that point to a very unusual history. And briefly, I'm going to get into these. We have petrified ships, and we have a couple of examples of these. The first is in Sunspear, where the Martell seat, they actually live inside a petrified ship called the Sand Ship. It looks like a giant Drummond that's washed ashore and turned to stone. We know that the Martells are an Andal house, and so they've been living in the Sand Ship for at most 5,000 years, but before that, we have no idea where the structure came from. So this is where the Sand Ship is located, near the Arm of Dorne again. It looks like it was turned to stone, but it's just a large mystery on why this stone petrified ship would be there. And this is just one of them. There's perhaps another one over in the Iron Isles. And this one is called Naga's Ribs. And the locals actually don't believe it's a ship. They believe that it's sea dragons' ribs turned to stone. And though sea dragons don't exist in our story, they're currently not a thing. Maesters question whether they ever existed. Like the Sand Ship, they're compared to Drummonds. They both turn to stone. They're both kind of near a flood zone. We know that they were both used as keeps at some point. And so, yes, it might be an actual petrified ribs of a giant whale, but people have noted that it could be the skeleton of a ship under construction. That ribs look very, very similar. Now, it should be noted that neither one of these ships are near anything like a thermal spring that we would normally associate with petrification. So in order for these ships to be petrified, you're talking about a process of millions and millions of years. And so seafaring people from millions and millions of years ago really throw a wrench in our narrative of Children of the Forest and then First Men and then Andals. We have a couple other things that are really weird and perplexing, and that is one odd thing about Westeros is there aren't any volcanoes. At least we don't hear about any except on Dragonstone. Dragonstone's the closest one. And yet, there's a place called Moat Cailin. Moat Cailin is famous for, this is where Theon convinced his own people, the Ironborn, to surrender, and they were all flayed. It's a very, very important strategic castle in the neck, and oddly, it has an enormous wall made of basalt out of huge bricks. Basalt is famously a volcanic rock. These huge bricks are the size of houses. They used to be part of a big giant wall. Even ignoring the question of how these things were transported, where did this basalt come from when there's no volcanoes in Westeros, and how was it transported here? And there's one more odd thing that really throws a wrench in the story. This is where the Moat Cailin is. And the last thing that's really odd are these black oily stones. Now this is mostly a book thing, but there are some odd black oily stones that exist all over the world. Some in far off places, some in the Iron Isles, but the most famous is actually in Old Town with Sam. It is the base of the High Tower. The High Tower is this incredibly large tower that's been in the city. And at the base of this High Tower is this oily black stone, which means, because it's at the base, it means it predates the founding of the city and the arrival of House Hightower and the First Men, which is 12,000 years ago. Who created this black stone is a mystery historically. It's black, it's oily, and it's been there longer. It predates all known civilization. And so I guess I'd like to finish up with this large mystery with our last poll. So I'll hand this back over to Eric.
Yep, we'll load up the last poll question. And we want to know what you think the black oily stones are. Do you think it's some sort of oil sandstone, serpentinite, meteorites, or, to really throw a wrench into things, could it be plastic? And this is another George R.R. Martin post-apocalyptic world that we're currently living in. So we'll close the polls in 3, 2, 1. Okay, we have a nice mix here. So meteorites went out with, let's see here, 32%. 28% think it's plastic. So we got some post-apocalyptic people here. 27% oil sandstone, and only 12 think it's serpentinite.
All right, and that is all I have. So some food for everyone to think about, and so let's open it up to some questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Preston, for that awesome presentation. If you have questions, you can type them into the question box. We've got a couple that we'll start off with, and we'll get to as many as we can. We have a fair amount of time here, so feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like. And please remember that Preston is not a professional geologist, so we've got geology questions. Don't make them too intricate. So first question here, Preston, from Sam, is did George R.R. Martin ever call his world Planetos, or is this something that came from the fans?
No, it's the fans. He might be using it now, but it certainly never appears in the books. It was a fan-created thing, just because there's a continent called Westeros and a continent called Essos and another one called Ulthos and Sotheros. So they just thought, well, if Os is added to everything, I guess it's Planetos. But I mean, the people in the story call the planet Earth, so it's a fan-made name. I'm sure George R. R. Martin has used it on occasion, but only because the fans invented it.
Okay, here's an intricate one from Mathieu. He asks, what do you think about the theory that a meteor destroyed the Arm of Dorne and started the Long Night?
Um, well, I mean, we definitely have a sea levels rising, and I mean, even the history tells us that sea levels have risen. So yes, you could throw in a meteorite striking, and that might move away some land. But there are other places on the planet too that show that sea levels have risen around the Thousand Islands, around the Iron Islands as well. Actually, Moat Cailin as well. It used to not be so marshy. So it's not that there couldn't be a meteorite that struck it, but there's no need when the Arm of Dorne could break with rising sea levels. So I mean, it's certainly something that's possible, but if one accepts that there are ice ages and that this is a parallel for the Bering Straits, then it's not necessary. But you know, there's nothing in the story that says it didn't happen.
So to add on to that, Anna Victoria asks if a meteorite could also mean that this world is post-apocalyptic. This could be the possible cause of an apocalypse.
Yeah, I mean, the world is definitely post-apocalyptic. The question is, what kind of apocalypse was it? Like we know that there were some great societies in the past, and you know things are now not as advanced. I mean, we know that something built the wall and something built Storm's End. They were more advanced in the past. Even if you believe in magic, maybe they were more advanced magically. But the point is, you know, the people have gone backwards, either scientifically or magically. So the question is, you know, it may even be that there's been many little apocalypses, because we do have the Long Night, which is supposedly 8,000 years ago, but then we have some other, you know, destructive events that seem to be happening that people claim is at, you know, 12,000 years ago, and then the Doom of Valyria happens 400 years ago, and that's a mini apocalypse, or Hardhome happened 600 years ago, and that's another kind of apocalypse. And then there's Karth. Karth clearly went through something. There's clearly climate change there that turned that environment from a habitable ecosystem into a desert. So it's tough. I mean, it could be that all of these histories are off and that there was just one single apocalyptic event, and everyone's been shifting around the time period. A meteorite, that's certainly possible. It might be something natural. It might be a nuclear war. I think there's a lot of different ideas. I don't know if we necessarily have enough information, but you know, I'm one that says nuclear war, but you know, it could be a lot more actually. So I'm not sure.
Okay, so speaking of winters, but not nuclear winters, John has the question: do you have an explanation for the, whether geologic, scientific, or just your own postulation for the very long, irregular winters? Are they just mini ice ages? And if so, what do you think could be causing these?
Well, I definitely think that our author has thought about planetary tilts and orbits. He has a lot of science fiction stories that take place on planets with irregular winters and irregular orbits. He has one called Bitter Blooms, where there's irregular winters that last for years. Another one with a Stone City, where the characters from a planet with irregular winters. So this isn't the first time he's done this. So he's thought about these things, and he's thought about irregular orbits, things coming back into play hundreds of years later and affecting things. So, and I also know in interviews he claims, oh, it's magic. There's no explanation. But I think he's being a little disingenuous when he says that. So, I mean, I think he's just thinking that there's perhaps, I mean, it might be that a comet came by or something knocked the Earth off its tilt to cause things to be a little irregular. People have said that, you know, I'm no astrophysicist, but this seems like something that could happen, that it's just simply a irregular planetary tilt that somehow happened, perhaps from a meteorite, perhaps from some massive explosion on the planet that caused things to get out of whack.
Okay, so I'm like we've got a lot coming in. Let's see. So Orr asks, this world seems to be in some sort of endless war. This world, so Planetos and the people that we're introduced to, seems to be in some sort of endless war. Why do you think that is?
I mean, this is going to sound a little crazy, but I believe mind control. So George R. R. Martin has a lot of stories about aliens influencing people with mind control, putting in bad ideas, visions, dreams, to cause people to fight themselves. I think that in our story we know, especially the book story, not so much in the show, but our characters are constantly plagued with dreams, and they constantly make really weird decisions after having these dreams. One example that you may know is Catelyn blacks out. It's a really weird scene where she just blacks out for hours and then wakes up, and then she decides she's going to let Jaime go. And a lot of people, look at that scene and say, "Oh my gosh, that was really crazy that Catelyn let Jaime out of prison and just let him free and trusted him. This is a guy who tossed her son out a window." But she just does that, and a lot of people are baffled by why she would do that. But also there was something very odd going on with her brain right before that. There's a story called "And Seven Times Never Kill Man," which is perhaps the best example of this, where a group of humans land on a planet, and then the leader starts having strange visions, and then he starts making really bad decisions, and they end up burning all of their food, and at the end of the story, everybody, well, spoilers, everybody starves at the end. So, I mean, you got to think, the Children of the Forest, they were killed off by humanity, and in our story, Bran questions that. He says, this is really odd that man killed off the Children of the Forest, and they aren't doing anything about it. Man would be wroth, is what he says. And so I wonder if the Children of the Forest are doing something about it. If they're sending really bad ideas, dreams, things to convince us to be religious zealots, things to convince us to go to war over the Iron Throne, to fight amongst ourselves and kill each other. So it sounds crazy, but yeah, I think the thing that's keeping humanity in the Dark Ages for thousands and thousands of years is bad dreams.
So, I don't think this is his real name, but Euron Greyjoy has a question I think is a good follow-up to that. How do you think this story will change if the characters ever find out that their history is all wrong?
I mean, the question is how can they find that out? And the only way they'll ever really find that out is to I guess find a really, really old artifact. But the problem is that artifacts decay, or perhaps this stuff is recorded in the werewoods. I think if humanity does discover this, I think it would be a beneficial thing. I think they would realize that they made these bad mistakes in the past, and that they need to give peace a chance. It should be noted that George R. R. Martin is a huge hippie. He was a conscientious objector. He did not participate in Vietnam. He instead did volunteer work with Vista, which is like AmeriCorps. He is most, if not all, of his stories are anti-war in theme. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope if humanity discovered this, they would realize their mistakes and perhaps try to put down their swords and make peace.
Cool. Switching gears, and actually, Miles touched on this at the very end of last week's webinar in the Q&A, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say, Preston. So Nicholas wants to know, what do you believe caused the doom of Valyria, and were the Valyrians directly responsible?
Yeah, that's interesting. Now, I read Miles's theory, and he points out, for anyone that didn't read it or see his presentation, that a large volcano would not have enough force to essentially sink the entire peninsula. You'd need a volcano that was, many thousand times bigger than any volcano that's ever been on Earth in order to do it. And if you had a volcano like that, you'd have massive global impacts everywhere else too. And so he theorizes that it was a meteor impact thousands of years ago, and then history just kind of got confused, and everyone was saying that Valyria was a peninsula when it wasn't. I think that there might be something geological going on underneath the Earth. I think it is very curious that there's no volcanoes in Westeros, and the Earth has so many tunnels and so many caves. Every major castle has a major tunnel system underneath it. And so I do wonder if this other society, if there was a futuristic society in the past, an advanced society in the past, if they relied on geothermal energy and had massive networks of geothermal lava flowing different places, and if they were using this energy somehow. One of the things I really ask myself is, what is making the wall stay around? Because that doesn't happen naturally. You would need some sort of power in order to refrigerate and re-refrigerate the wall. Something is going automatically in order to keep that together. And even if you say magic, well, it's some sort of magical power that's keeping the wall together, not sublimating, not falling apart. And so I do wonder if beneath the Earth there are large geological mechanisms, machinery. And I wonder if the Valyrians had tapped into some of these and didn't know how to handle them, and perhaps they broke down. Or if many people point to the Faceless Men, they were slaves underneath the Valyrians, and that it was all a massive sabotage. And I would say that's quite likely, that if the Valyrians did have a great underground geothermal power society, that perhaps these slaves sabotaged their mechanisms and caused a large enough explosion, one that could be 1,000 times more powerful than a volcano.
Interesting. So, help me here, Preston.
Sure.
'Cause I'm not as much of a book geek as you or some of the other audience members, but do we have evidence of strange season timing and weird years before the Doom of Valyria?
Well, we have no records, so we don't
Okay.
know, what happened. I mean, as far back as at least the Maesters, I imagine it's before the Doom of Valyria. The Maesters have been recording history, I guess, when the Andals arrived. So history goes back about 5,000 years, and so the Doom is 400 years ago. So I would be pretty certain that irregular seasons go back at least as far as Maester history. So I would say that the Doom of Valyria is probably not the thing that caused the irregular seasons. But it's possible that we had regular seasons at some point, or maybe we never had regular seasons. But I think it's older than 400 years.
Okay, because an impact. I mean, some planetary scientists may correct me immediately on the chat board here and say I'm crazy, but forgive me, I'm a hydrologist. But an impact could, at least in the eye of George R.R. Martin, have knocked both the tilt and the orbit a little out of wonk, and that could have been the impetus for giving us these crazy seasons that we see on Planetos. Yeah. Okay, I'll go back to the audience questions. I'm just having fun as host. So, okay, recent spoiler. I don't think this is a spoiler, but thank you for being conscious of that, Robert. Robert points out there's dragon glass under Dragonstone. Is there a volcano there, or do you think this was dragon-made, and hence the name?
No, I mean, Dragonstone definitely was volcanic before the dragons kind of got there. Um, the the only came to Dragonstone 400 right before the Doom. And so they didn't create the volcano. So it's one of the few volcanoes, the closest volcanoes. If you think Dragonstone's part of Westeros, I mean, it is an island off the coast, but it's the only volcano that we know about in Westeros. There's some question of whether or not the lake in the middle, the God's Eye, was a volcano and became a caldera, but we don't know of any other volcanoes other than Dragonstone. But yeah, I think it was naturally a volcano. And that the Targaryens purposely went there because it's good for hatching dragon eggs and such.
Okay, so Eric's got a really interesting question. It's a two-parter. I'm going to try merge it into one. So you pointed out that George R.R. Martin, while not a scientist, he's a layman in terms of science, but he still obviously cares about science. Since science has changed even in the last 20 years and access to information with the web, yada, 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 do you think George will adjust or include some of this information in his final reveal in the series, even if only as clues for those who are looking for the science story and not the mythical story? So do you think our author will adjust the plot in any way to include any advances that we have in science since he started this series?
Yeah, I do. I mean, he claims that he doesn't. I mean, he says he knows how everything will end, but he doesn't have much detail. Many details on things in between. He claims that he gets bored if he knows the whole story. So yeah, I think that anything that comes along, he'll try to include. And he's done that somewhat not with science, but he's done it with politics. It's tough not to see a bunch of parallels between Dany in Slaver's Bay and, say, the American adventures in Iraq. And that's he added fairly contemporary information in that, and so he does do that. So I mean, I could see him throwing in something to do with more recent science if he comes across it. If he's still reading up on it, I imagine he is.
Cool. So Elias wants to know what's up with the red waste, and how likely or unlikely is it to be natural?
Ooh, the red waste is a super, super huge mystery. Nothing about it really makes sense. So if you go to Qarth has 3 walls. The innermost wall is marble, the middle wall is granite, and the outermost wall is sandstone. And the drawings on the walls are, the innermost wall has people having sex, the middle wall has people having war, and the outermost wall is scenes of nature. And so at first glance, as you're heading into the city, you kind of say, well, okay, you start with nature, and then you have war, and then the last phase is luxury, modernity. And that seems logical at first until you say, well, wait a minute, why is the innermost wall the modern one? Like, you can't build walls inward. Like, that wouldn't make any sense. You'd have to demolish buildings. It'd be really impractical to do that. And then the other weird thing is, wait a minute, you have both sandstone and granite and marble in a massive amount, in the same area. Like, geologically, that's kind of ridiculous. Did they import all of this granite, enough to build an entire city wall? That's just a lot of granite. I mean, and so everything is kind of a contradiction. People from Qarth are super, super pale, and yet it's the middle of the desert. Usually people in the desert, tend to be darker in complexion. And so I definitely, I think it has something to do with climate change. I would guess that the Qartheen were subterranean at some point, and that's why they're pale. They were living underground, perhaps during an apocalypse period. And then they came out, and their land was a desert. It's hard to say because it's one of these places that I've scratched my head so much because nothing really makes sense about it. But it's pretty clear that climate change happened there. There used to be nature, and now it's a red waste. And nothing else seems to make sense about the society. We don't know if they're progressing or regressing in technology. We don't know if you know, or maybe they regressed and progressed again. We don't know why they're pale. We don't know where these stones came from. It's a big mix-up, and I suppose intentional from our author on that. It's maybe not supposed to make sense, just to make us question everything.
Right. Going back to the whole maybe it's apocalypse, maybe they regressed. Yeah, gotcha. So a couple of people have asked about, the last slide that you showed, the black oily stones, and I'm going to read Diego's question. He says, how do you feel about the oily black stone found all over the known world? Do you think it may be from pre-Children of the Forest? Also, how may it relate to other continents we've yet to see?
So it's interesting. So these black stones, they mainly show up in the book that only the nerds bought, which is the World of Ice and Fire, and it mentions that these black oily stones are on in Old Town and the Iron Isles. And yeah, I think it's to point out. I think it's to point out that history doesn't make sense. Certainly, that you're having this somewhat advanced society all over the world that predates all of the other ones, and it's definitely to show that our history is wrong. But it's and then the fact that it's of a substance that no one knows what it is, I would personally lean to the plastic, saying that, oh, these people are advanced. And so could they actually predate the children of the forest? I would say that, yeah, there's definitely I'd say there's definitely a chance of that. Especially if you're talking about petrified ships. You have a massive, if you're talking about seafaring society from millions of years ago, I'm not sure if they're the same society that built the oily stones, but it's all to point out that none of this history is supposed to make sense. He's purposely throwing a wrench in everything and saying, these things are in contradiction. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to have answers because there just aren't any good answers. So another thing that I think it's used for is, so if you read this book, The World of Ice and Fire, they also have a bunch of parallel situations around the world where people are fighting creatures not like the White Walkers, but enemies. There's a place called the Five Forts that's made out of this black oily stone, and the Five Forts are up against the desert, and they're fighting, demons that come from this desert. And this is clearly a parallel to the Wall, where an ice, people are keeping out this enemy. But we don't actually have to go that far for these parallels. We can go to Cracklaw Point, where Brienne explored, and we find the Squishers. And again, like, we have this society facing these weird metahumans that are demons or enemies coming from the sea. If I were going to have a unifying theory about everything, I would say that, okay, whatever disaster happened in our past, there were elements like mutation, evolution, perhaps genetic engineering, that would unite all of these stories between sort of the demons at the Five Forts and the Squishers and the White Walkers. Something that made, if the Earth had this massive climate change, perhaps human beings needed to evolve or change themselves with genetic engineering in order to live better on this planet. And so that would be my guess on what's going on, that the others are human beings, the White Walkers are human beings, and if the whole world is falling into winter, maybe the best thing is to genetically engineer yourself to live better in that environment, while other humans went underground and other humans went into the sea and other humans went into the desert or something, and and changed. But it gets into it's a lot of crazy out there talk, I know, but it's not too off the mark from other George R.R. Martin stories. But that's where I think the oily stones kind of go, that there was this old society that's advanced that fell, and then humanity from that older society changed into all of the creatures that we know today.
I feel sorry for anyone that just joined the webinar because they're probably like, "Oh my God, what's going on?" So I'm gonna shift gears from black things to red things. Anna here wants to know what she asks. Preston, what's your take on the red comet?
The red comet. So George R. R. Martin has a lot of science fiction stories about celestial objects that are not actually celestial objects. You know, they're actually spaceships, or they're actually spacefaring aliens. And so for a while I was making this joke that the comet is a Vulcan, which is the spacefaring alien from George R. R. Martin's story called Night Flyers. And in that story, this spacefaring alien actually propels itself across the galaxy using telekinesis. And as he passes different planets, people's telepathy and telekinesis abilities go nuts. And he actually claims that this creature passed Earth around the time of Christ, and therefore he's implying that Jesus's miracles were actually all telekinetic abilities caused by this Vulcan. I don't know if it's an alien, but I'm willing to accept that it's perhaps something that could enhance people's telepathic abilities or magical abilities. If you just want to go away from the sci-fi, that perhaps the comet is something that is stimulating people on the planet and making them them wake up a bit. I mean, keep in mind that Daenerys was able to hatch her dragons when this comet came, and was able to perhaps protect herself from fire, in a perhaps pyrokinetic way. And so, maybe maybe it's a coincidence, or maybe it's just all magic and it's not meant to be explained. But George R. R. Martin has another story where something in the sky enhanced telepathic, telekinetic abilities, and that sort of thing happens at Dany at that point. I mean, it's hard to say if he's gone into that much detail, but I do think there's significance to it. So I mean, maybe it's a big spacefaring alien that enhances telepathy. Maybe it's a spaceship, but I don't think it's a comet. I think that would be too boring. I think it's something else. Whether it just be something magical in the sky, or a spaceship, or an alien, I think it's something besides a comet.
Okay, we have like tons of awesome questions, and there's no way we're going to get to all of them in 2 minutes. So, Preston, quickly, would it be okay if people contacted you on Twitter or through your YouTube?
Sure.
I don't know if you want to share that out loud.
Sure. I mean, I've got my YouTube channel, which is just Preston Jacobs. If you're in YouTube, I have a Facebook page, Preston Jacobs, the Sweet Robin. I have a Twitter account, which is Preston Jacobs at Sweet Robin 9000.
Okay, and then we'll end with a question Michael has, because it's kind of portends to an end anyway. Michael asks, will killing the Night's King end the Long Night? And if so, how can that be explained?
I mean, I don't think so. But I mean, unless there's some sort of really strange magic to it all, I don't see how the killing a single individual could affect the entire world. I mean, unless he has some sort of massive telepathic, telekinetic connection to the seasons, but that's a bit much. I mean, what's funny is we don't actually have any evidence that the Long Night is coming. Everyone says that the Long Night is coming, but do we have any evidence that it's coming? No, it's wintertime is coming. I mean, so that's the one thing I do question about the series is that on our Earth, there's plenty of doomsday zealots out there who claim that the doomsday is coming, and by doing so, it almost causes more harm than good. by claiming that the end is nigh, and as a battle cry. And so I do question whether or not Jon's battle cry to stop the Night King is really helpful. I mean, has the Night King really done anything that's been too aggressive? Maybe attacking Hardhome, but he hasn't crossed the wall yet. We've been the aggressors. We've gone into their territory and attacked them with dragonglass, and have been arming ourselves with dragonglass, the human side. So maybe they're just defending themselves, and maybe there is no long night coming, and just a regular winter. It's hard to say, or maybe the Night's King just knows the math and knows the history and knows when the next long night is coming, just on a natural Earth tilt kind of way. But I see no reason to think that he has some sort of magical or telepathic connection to the whole world like that. But,
unless he's the final Horcrux. Okay, I'll see myself out. With that, Preston, it's been an awesome webinar. Thanks for geeking out with us, and thanks to all our audience for geeking out. It's a fun little...
Yeah, I went full tinfoil on this one with the questions. Yeah.
We've had some people ask this, but we will be sending out the link and a follow-up email to watch the recording, and our plans are to put both part 1 and part 2 on YouTube. We'll need to clean up those recordings a little bit, but look for that on the AGU YouTube channel sometime next week. Preston, I don't know if you have any parting words?
No, just thanks everyone for stopping by and listening to me ramble.
Yeah, thank you, Preston, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.